The origin for the study came from our observations with Nurtec ODT, where we saw in a long-term safety study a reduction in disability due to migraine based on the migraine the specific disability scale. And there's a component of that scale where you can actually estimate time lost due to migraine. So that the time loss is both a combination of when you're prevented from doing either a work, household, or school activity, or whether you're impaired. And you can come up with a formula to assess the actual time in days lost due to migraine, which is the prevention plus the impairment times 0.5. That gives you that formula. So that observation from our clinical trial led me to think about how we could look at perhaps there's the actual disability or the impairment in terms of days lost, but is there an economic component to that? In other words, is there an association with healthcare costs and additional pharmacy costs that are associated with this impairment and this prevention of activity? And so I was able to identify an external real-world database from essentially what we call administrative claims linked to electronic medical record database. In the medical record, routinely, many clinicians will use the MIDAS score to assess how their patients are faring over time. It's very useful to assess the level of disability in migraine using a particular scale, because they can compare, one office visit to a subsequent office visit, et cetera. They can look at, whether patients are really benefiting from their treatments or not in a quantitative way. And so this data was available in this database. And in addition to that, being a claims EMR database, the claims provide, they're called procedure codes, NDC codes, which permit one to actually accumulate the healthcare resource use, ED visits, regular office visits, and even hospitalizations. And then you can apply average costs to that, per diem cost to those resources. And this is primarily a commercially insured data source. So we looked to see, first of all, you had to assess the size of the eligible, the study population. In this data source, there are about 7,000 migraine patients, episodic migraine patients who had the MIDAS assessment. And so that allowed us to that was a fairly decent sized sample to be able to look at the distribution of time lost due to migraine with associated costs associated with that. So even though it's an observational study, there's an underlying hypothesis, which is that there's a relationship between the amount of time lost due to migraine and healthcare costs, utilization of costs, because it's an index of disability. And so we were able to do that. We had a sufficient sample of 7,000 patients. We accumulated costs, and we did see a relationship. So one of the things, just looking at the distribution of time lost due to migraine, in about, I think it was 12% of patients, we saw patients reporting 30 days of time lost due to migraine out of a 3-month period. That's a substantive amount of time. So 30 days when they were either not able to do their work, household, school, or leisure activities entirely, or whether they were impaired in doing so. They were only doing it with at half capacity. We found about 20% reported about between 11 and 30 days of time lost due to migraine. So when you combine those two numbers, you're really talking about a substantive population of patients, about 35%, that are really losing a lot of their ability to work and go to school and household and leisure because of migraine. It points to the disabling nature of the condition. And then we saw that costs were essentially associated with the level of time loss. So just looking at 6 months worth of costs per patient, looking at both pharmacy costs separately from ER visits, hospitalizations, and routine office visits, on average, you went from about $1,000 of either pharmacy and or healthcare resource use costs over a 6-month period, down to about 800 when you get to a level of moderate, from severe impairment to moderate impairment, and even when you get down to about 50% reduction in cost when you get to the level of mild impairment. So in terms of the number of days lost due to migraine. So clearly the impact of migraine on patients' level of disability is objectively assessed this way, but also it's linked to these costs. And the goal is to kind of, what we're going to do in future studies is to really take our data, our Nurtec data, where we have MIDAS data and lost time due to migraine, and on an individual patient level, using a predictive model, we'll actually be able to map those days lost to actual cost based on this model. So we're leveraging the external data set to first of all, to show the level of impairment and the cross-sectional relationship between time lost due to migraine and costs. But then we're going to go take it a step further and look at develop a predictive model to be able to say, for any given patient in our long-term study, what was the, when you had an improvement in time lost due to migraine, what would be the projected savings as a result of that? So it really, and for commercially insured systems, and also about 17% of this population were also Medicare patients. So you had commercial, about 65% plus a substantive number of Medicare patients. It's important to establish this with these insurers. When they're assessing the value of interventions, it's important to look at, yes, the efficacy of the drug and how it treats in this case, the migraine attack, but are there other downstream medical benefits? And from a pharmacoeconomics perspective, those arguments are quite compelling. Why? Because they provide an additional perspective on the value of the therapeutic. And so it all tied together very nicely. And we were working with Dr. Lipton, who was the developer of the MIDAS scale in the first place. He's collaborated on much of the work that I've done. And he and one of his colleagues developed the concept of time lost due to migraine. So he was very interested in collaborating and co-authoring on this work. And we will generate a publication based on the work. So it was really our experience with Nurtec, our positive experience with Nurtec in terms of disability, and the availability of this real-world database that mapped MIDAS scores to costs and healthcare resource use. And then the next step will be an ability to actually predict resource utilization associated with the changes in MIDAS score in our database and in other populations as well. So a very satisfying body of work to illustrate one. And I think one of the things that is important with these assessments, it really does point to the point that I made previously, the disabling nature of migraine. It's not just a headache. It's really, I think, particularly when it comes to preventing you from doing your activities of daily living or impairing those activities. And when you combine the two together, the level of impairment is quite high. So therapies, I think, that alleviate that or reduce that. And on average, in our 201 study, we saw about an 11-day improvement in time lost due to migraine, which would translate into substantive reductions in costs. So.